Thanks to everyone who viewed and liked and commented on the previous episode. I wasn't really expecting anybody to like this. I was thinking it'd be more like an archival thing that people could reference when they were discussing the game. But people do seem kind of interested in it in and of itself. I've got some suggestions in the comments which I will be following up, but for now I'm going to do Iosefka's Clinic. I'm not going to be touching on the whole imposter Iosefka versus real Iosefka situation, because the point of these videos is to get up close and look at minor details that aren't immediately apparent, whereas the whole imposter Iosefka plotline is a fairly serious part of the game. That having been said, I do want to look at the two Iosefkas for a bit. Here I've used a glitch that's now been patched out, which allowed you to get into the back of Iosefka's clinic before the game intended you to. This allows me to get behind the door and show you the Iosefka model that's on the other side of it. This is the real Iosefka. You can't interact with her, you can't attack her, you can't do anything. She's a purely graphical object. You can talk to her, but you have to talk to her as if you're on the other side of the doors. It's only really checking if you're near the door area, not the model. Iosefka is unarmed, and she is wearing the white church set. The description of the white church set reads, "Attire of special church doctors. These doctors are superiors to the black preventative hunters, and specialists in experimentally backed blood ministration and the scourge of the beast. They believe that medicine is not a means of treatment, but rather a method of research, and that some knowledge can only be obtained by exposing oneself to sickness." We can infer numerous things about Iosefka from the fact she is wearing this set, but the problem is that we're not supposed to be able to see that she's wearing this set, because I'm using a glitch to show you this. And before I go on, I want to show you the model that the imposter Iosefka uses, which is the exact same model. Every detail is identical, it's just armed with the threaded cane and the repeating pistol. So arguably we shouldn't infer anything from what the original Iosefka wears, as they've simply duplicated a model that we see later on. However, when we fight the imposter Iosefka, the weapons and items she uses are things that are very heavily associated with the choir, like a Call Beyond and the Augur of Ebrietas, which only very high-ranking members of the choir are supposed to have access to. But she's not wearing the choir set, she's wearing the white church set. So it is possible that the white church set we see the imposter Iosefka wearing is actually the original clothing of the real Iosefka, which the imposter Iosefka has taken and is using to help her assume Iosefka's identity. So if this was the original Iosefka's clothing, then we can make a number of inferences about who she was. White church hunters are described as specialists in experimentally backed blood ministration. And what does the real Iosefka do? She provides us with special blood vials. The product of a slow and careful refinement process, this rare blood vial appears to be a clinic original. So it's easy to see how this fits with her being a white church doctor. She's been experimenting with blood ministration, and she's managed to concoct this new kind of extremely potent blood that no one outside of her clinic has seen before. The white church set also describes the white church doctors as people that believe that medicine is not a means of treatment, but rather a method of research, and that some knowledge can only be obtained by exposing oneself to sickness. Again, this fits perfectly with the character that we meet, because what's she doing? She's operating a clinic that's well outside of Cathedral Ward, which means she would be exposed to all kinds of sicknesses, but that she would be doing so in a sterile, controlled environment. So I'd say that there is a reasonably good chance that the real Iosefka is one of the white church doctors. There are numerous environmental clues with regard to what the fake Iosefka is doing and how she's going about it, but the problem is the timing. Bloodborne is, especially in comparison to other Souls games, extremely linear, and the passage of time plays a big role in it. The real Iosefka is replaced by the fake after we enter Erden Chapel for the first time, during which point in the game's timeline it is still the early evening. We can't get access to the back of the clinic and figure out what's really going on until after we've examined the skull on the Grand Cathedral altar, and doing that shifts the time ahead from the evening to what looks to be roughly midnight. So with this in mind, let's look at the back of Iosefka's clinic. What we're entering through doesn't appear to actually be a door. It looks more like a window that's been knocked out. You can see shards of glass on the ground nearby. And you'll also notice that in order to get there, we cross a series of very, very crudely made plank bridges on the roof. So clearly you're not supposed to be able to come and go through this part of the clinic. And what we're coming and going through is a makeshift entrance that's been added. It looks very, very hastily. But as I mentioned with the timeline, it's hard to tell exactly when this was supposed to be added. This could have been there for a while, but equally it could have been added, just after we beat Gascoigne. It's not clear. We find a brain sucker immediately down the ladder, but this kind of doesn't tell us anything helpful either, as the process by which imposter Iosefka is turning people into Celestials does appear to be extremely quick. We send someone there, and then by the time we've reloaded the clinic, they've been transformed. So although Celestials and Brainsuckers clearly aren't the same thing, we do know from what imposter Iosefka does that the transformation process can be very, very rapid. So the presence of a Brainsucker here doesn't really help us establish any kind of time frame. There is some stuff outside of the clinic that does give us more of a hint toward the time frame, but I want to stick to the clinic itself for now. Provided you don't glitch it, there will always be at least 2 Celestials present in the back of the clinic. There is one that spawns near the door and drops Iosefka's blood vial when it's killed, which implies, I think beyond a shadow of a doubt, this is Iosefka, the real Iosefka, whom the imposter Iosefka has experimented on and transformed into this Celestial. Other than dropping the blood vial, though, there's really nothing unique or interesting about this particular Celestial. There is another Celestial at the back of the clinic that, to me, is actually quite interesting, because it's not a standard Celestial model. The model that's used is actually a unique one. If you get up close to it, you can see that it has patches of still human skin, and one of its hands is still human. Even if the difference in colour doesn't give it away, you can tell because the Celestials have 6 fingers on each hand. It's a trait that they share with the amygdala. This hand only has 5 fingers on it, so it's a human hand. This always loads, as I said. It's not one of the NPCs that we send there. I don't know if it is supposed to be a specific NPC. I think it's just there to clue us into what the imposter Iosefka is doing. But I do have one odd theory. This is a piece of complete speculation. I don't think there's much to back it up, but I'm going to talk about it anyway. I think that this may actually be the man in the wheelchair who gives you the blood ministration at the beginning of the game. One thing I always thought was strange was that as you're leaving Iosefka's clinic for the first time and you see the wolf beast eating the bodies on the ground, you do not see that minister anywhere. Now again, the time frame of Bloodborne is still quite nebulous and confusing to me, but it doesn't seem like that long has passed in between you getting the ministration and you waking up to discover the wolf beast in the clinic. You also notice that the door to the clinic is shut, and outside of that, the gate to Yharnam is shut. So it doesn't look like anyone was able to get away. And we do find bodies, but we don't find the body of the minister. So my initial hunch there was, well, maybe the minister turned into the wolf. And that's entirely possible too. But you'd think if that happened, we would find the wheelchair, because Bloodborne does have a wheelchair model without anyone in it that it does load on some maps. And then I went to the back of the clinic, and I noticed that, there's the wheelchair model. And there it is, in the hallway that leads to the room with that not quite fully transformed Celestial in it. So, given that, imposter Iosefka turns everyone in the clinic into a Celestial, and given that there is a minister who appears to work at the clinic and is not accounted for after the intro of the game, it is entirely possible that that's the origin of this partially transformed corpse. Perhaps imposter Iosefka used him as a guinea pig before she perfected the process and then used that on the real Iosefka and the other people that we send to the clinic. But there's something else about that minister that I think is extremely significant, and that's the way he talks about Paleblood. The very first thing he says in the game is,
"Oh, yes, Paleblood."
But then he qualifies it by saying,
"Well, you've come to the right place. Yharnam is the home of blood ministration. You need only unravel its mystery."
Nothing in that sentence implies he actually knows what Paleblood is. Only that if you're looking for blood, you go to Yharnam and get ministered. If he knew, he would have given us some kind of concrete answer like, "Oh, Paleblood, I've got some round the back," or, "Oh, Paleblood, go to the healing church." But he doesn't say that. He actually says, we're going to have to unravel the mystery. And now look at what Gilbert says.
Paleblood, you say? Never heard of it. But if it's blood you're interested in, you should try the healing church. The church controls all knowledge on blood ministration and all varieties of blood. Across the valley to the east of Yharnam lies the town of the Healing Church, known as the Cathedral Ward. And deep within Cathedral Ward is the old Grand Cathedral, the birthplace of the Healing Church's special blood. Or so they say. Yharnamites don't share much with outsiders.
The two key things here are that Yharnamites are notoriously insular and xenophobic, and also that Gilbert, an outsider, does not know what Paleblood is either. There are, in fact, only two groups in the entirety of Bloodborne who unequivocally know that something called Paleblood even exists. Those are, firstly, the School of Mensis, as we find references to Paleblood in both Yahar'gul and the Nightmare Lecture Theatre. The second, interestingly, seems to be the player character, because according to the Japanese version of the game, we left that handwritten scroll saying, "Seek Paleblood to transcend the hunt." And given the way that the Nameless Blood Minister addresses us at the very beginning of the game, it seems that we asked him, off camera, where to find Paleblood. So, interestingly, in Paleblood we seem to have something that outsiders to Yharnam don't know about, but also the ministers of Yharnam don't know about. It's apparently completely unknown outside of this secret society, but we know about it, and we've never even been to Yharnam before. I have my own theory about what's going on here, but I do want to get back to the clinic, because that is the topic of this video. So, back to the inhuman experiments of imposter Iosefka. One interesting detail I noticed about her room is that it's filled with these chairs, and we see them all around the clinic, but there's an awful lot of them in the room that imposter Iosefka is located in. And they are covered in these straps that would allow you to secure a person into them. Since we find a lot of them in Iosefka's room, and they're all very haphazardly arranged, I think this is what she's strapping people into when she turns them into Celestials. We also find one in the clinic's foyer that's been knocked over, and I think this is where the werewolf we find might have come from. As I said when discussing the minister, the door and the gate of the clinic are both shut, so the werewolf doesn't seem to have come in from inside. It seems to have been a patient of the clinic who transformed. And I thought, well, if they transformed, they likely did so on one of the operating tables like the kind that we wake up on. But then I noticed that none of the tables are empty. They all have stuff on them. So I don't think that whoever this was on a table when they transformed. It's also worth pointing out that that upturned chair is roughly opposite the corpse where we find the first blood vials of the game. So it's possible that the wolf person was in that chair, transformed, killed that guy, and then ran inside the clinic and finished off the people who were in it. However, this scenario requires the wolf person to have been strapped into the chair in the clinic's foyer. So I'm not entirely sure that's a standard operating procedure for this clinic, but you never know. Elsewhere around the clinic, we find just sort of random assortments of bottles and syringes. I don't think these have any real story significance. They just seem to be a piece of environmental detail, in case you forgot you were in a clinic. Some of the bottles do have HCl written on them. HCl is something you see written on a lot of medication. It stands for hydrochloride salt, and all it means is that this medication is in the form of a water-soluble powder. So it's nothing particularly significant. We also see a lot of broken glass on the clinic's floor. It's the same broken glass that you see near the window that's been knocked out to create the makeshift back entrance for the clinic. Here, though, it's just kind of placed on the floor. It's not near any windows, so I think it's meant to just be the broken glass from the various bottles that we see lining the shelves of the clinic. We also see a lot of chain on the ground, and I think the chain probably served a similar purpose to the chairs. It's used to secure patients on the off chance that they transform. We also find a lot of chain near where we first encounter the wolf, so it's possible that the wolf was a patient who was chained up and somehow broke their bonds after transforming. There also appears to be a second level to the clinic that we're not able to normally access, and there doesn't appear to actually be anything up there. It's possible that this is a gallery from which people could watch operations being performed. If Iosefka is a White Church doctor, then that means that she occupies a relatively senior position within the Healing Church, so it makes sense that the Healing Church would send apprentice doctors and students around to watch her from the gallery and learn by observation. So, with the real Iosefka and her clinic covered, I now want to move on to discussing the imposter Iosefka in slightly more depth. As I said earlier, all signs point to imposter Iosefka being a member of the choir. And she is, as we discussed, turning people into Celestials. And as you send people there, she will progressively reward you with rare items. I thought that the blue elixirs and lead elixirs that were given by imposter Iosefka might have been byproducts of her experiments. And it's possible, but I think a better explanation is simply that, as a member of the choir, imposter Iosefka has access to all of these strange concoctions, and she's simply rewarding us with them. Interestingly, though, upon receiving these gifts from imposter Iosefka, we gain insight. And this seems significant to me because although we're being given these very arcane, strange items from her, they're not things in the game that are associated with gaining insight. We only gain insight when we get them from imposter Iosefka. It's almost like imposter Iosefka is gaining insight from these experiments she's performing in the back of the clinic.
Don't you see how much this means?
We also gain insight in a similar way by talking with Willem. Well, talking's not really the right word, but you know what I mean. And remember, all Willem does is go and point at a lake with his staff. So we've not learned anything, we've not gained anything, but he's somehow given us insight. And keep in mind that this is not insight that we gain from knowing about Rom, because we get insight separately when we enter Rom's boss room. And remember that the standard way of gaining insight through an item in the game is Madman's Knowledge, which is just a skull. We don't learn anything specifically from the skull because it's a skull. So it's almost like your insight can be gained in numerous ways, and one of them almost appears to be a physical thing. You can somehow transfuse insight from person to person in the same way that we transfuse blood. The other thing about imposter Iosefka's experiments is that once she's turned someone into a Celestial, she just abandons them. She shows no further interest in them, and if we go in the back of the clinic and start murdering them, she doesn't care at all. So they're not something she's keeping alive for further study. She just seems to be keeping them alive because she can't be bothered killing them. It's in a lot of ways similar to Seath from Dark Souls imprisoning and transforming people in his experiments to try to prolong his life. But Seath had a very sadistic edge to him. There was almost a kind of sexual element to what Seath was doing, in that he was very specifically capturing and doing horrible things to women. Whereas imposter Iosefka seems to be a lot more pragmatic and clinical in her approach. So the transformation of humans into Celestials here seems to be a byproduct of something. It's not an end in itself, which raises the question of what imposter Iosefka is actually trying to do. And again, to completely speculate, I think what she's trying to do here is recreate whatever happened at Bergenworth that produced Rom. I'll go into the precise connection between Iosefka's clinic and the Bergenworth area later on in this video, but for now I just want to look at the state we find imposter Iosefka in toward the end of the game after we've killed Rom and the blood moon has risen.
God, I'm nauseous. Have you felt this? It's progressing. I can see things. I knew it. I'm different. I'm no beast. Oh, God, it feels awful. But it proves that I'm chosen. Don't you see how they writhe inside my head? It's rather rapturous.
And if we kill her, she drops a third umbilical cord. One of the popular theories that's banded about a lot with regard to this is that imposter Iosefka has fallen pregnant under the blood moon in the same way that Ariana has, and that we're actually removing the third umbilical cord from her body or the body of her unborn child. There are two reasons why I don't think this is true, though. The first is that if we look at what imposter Iosefka says when she's describing her symptoms, there's nausea, which of course Ariana has, but she also says that there are things writhing inside her head and that she can see things. This, to me, is consistent with gaining insight. Gaining insight allows you to perceive things that other people can't, a good example being the enormous amygdala that's squatting on Erden Chapel. We also start perceiving the eyes on the church servants' lanterns, and we can see, for instance, mad ones spawning in Hemwick Charnel Lane. So while it's unclear precisely what imposter Iosefka is seeing things is entirely consistent with insight gain. I also think it's extremely notable that imposter Iosefka talks about things writhing in her head, because if you look at the graphics for Madman's Knowledge and Great One's Wisdom, they are literally a head with a series of slugs writhing in them. The other reason I would argue that she's not pregnant is the description of the cord that she drops. The three other cords that we find all have a description that relates to where and how we acquire them. The cord we find in the abandoned old workshop specifically references the Hunter's Dream, which of course the workshop was the basis for. The cord we get from Ariana's child explicitly mentions Erden, who is presumed to be the child's father. And the one we get from Murgo's wet nurse explicitly talks about how Mensis were able to get audience with Murgo using the cord. But the one that we get from imposter Iosefka actually just talks about Willem. Provost Willem sought the cord in order to elevate his being and thoughts to those of a great one by lining his brain with eyes. The only choice, he knew, if man were to ever match their greatness. Now this is very odd, because you'd expect if the cord were related to imposter Iosefka or to the choir, it would talk about that, but it doesn't. It talks about Willem and it talks about Bergenworth, yet we don't find it in Bergenworth. Now I'm going to go into this later on, but the choir do have access to Bergenworth. We know this because there is at least one choir member there, and I'm going to say in another video that there's actually possibly more, but we'll get to that when we get to it. It's also possible to get to Bergenworth via the secret passage that's found in the graveyard near Iosefka's clinic. And notably, imposter Iosefka will not start writhing around like this until after you kill Rom, who is described as hiding all manner of rituals. So what I'm going to argue is this cord came from Bergenworth. Given that Rom is an ascended human being, it's possible that the cord is actually inside of her body and we simply aren't able to retrieve it. And interestingly, we find a corpse in the upper cathedral ward, which is run by the choir, that looks an awful lot like Rom. So it's possible that the choir have somehow retrieved Rom's body after we killed her, and then they've taken it back to Cathedral Ward and performed some kind of autopsy and removed the cord from it. A flaw with this, though, is it makes you wonder why the cord has ended up with imposter Iosefka at this clinic rather than safeguarded in the upper Cathedral Ward. So it's also possible that imposter Iosefka has herself gone to Bergenworth and ransacked it after we're done there and found this cord. So imposter Iosefka seems to have figured out that the key to ascending from a human to a Great One is the acquisition of the third umbilical cords. So her experimentation on her patients may have simply been her just trying to figure out exactly how the ascension process works. Now, the imposter Iosefka never actually herself ascends. It's not clear exactly how long it takes to ascend to a Great One. We don't know how long it took Rom, and when the player ascends to a Great One in the third ending, there's no indication again of the exact passage of time. So it's unclear as to whether imposter Iosefka's ascension is actually working, and it's simply taking a very long time, or it's kind of 1/3 working and she hasn't figured out what to do to push it forward. Because, remember, she only has 1 cord and you need 3 to ascend. So it's possible that she may in fact be transforming, but into a kind of mindless creature like Rom, rather than a legitimate Great One like the kind that we become in the third ending. So that about wraps it up for the 2 Iosefkas. But now I want to go and talk about the back entrance to the clinic in a little more detail. As I noted earlier in the video, the back of Iosefka's clinic leads directly to Forbidden Woods via a secret passage inside one of the graves. We find a very, very crude ladder down the grave. The grave itself looks to have been very recently disturbed. You can see the grave's original contents off to the side, and going down into it we find it's still got bodies in it. So this looks to be something that was done very hastily in the very recent past. Alternatively, this may be something that has been going on for a long time, and this passageway is something that is set up and torn down and set up and torn down on a regular basis, hence why it looks to be very hastily constructed. I lean toward this interpretation because the church don't seem to have any other way of getting to and from Bergenworth, as the front door, so to speak, to Bergenworth has been locked for so long that the watchman has in fact decomposed. And if the choir see themselves as the inheritors of what Willem was doing, it makes sense that they would want a way to surreptitiously come and go from Bergenworth. Down the bottom of the ladder in the cavern, we also find 3 church giants. These giants are unique in that they're not wearing the church giants' usual attire, they're just covered in bandages. So initially I thought, well, perhaps these are just giants, the Healing Church doesn't know about them. But on closer inspection you can see that they have the same bells and the same wrist and ankle clamps that the Healing Church giants have. So it seems more likely that these particular giants were put here simply as guards, as an extra precaution to stop people going back and forth via this hidden passageway. And I guess the lack of robes is simply because no one's supposed to see them. The ground of the cavern is also poisonous, which again would serve to stop people coming and going. Interestingly, the safest way to cross here without an antidote is actually to where the White Church Doctor's set, and this set is found directly outside of the cavern. From a gameplay point of view, it's obviously there because this is the way you're supposed to enter the cavern. But the presence of this corpse with the White Church Doctor's set on it, and also the choir members that we find in Bergenworth, suggests that the Healing Church are coming and going fairly regularly from the Forbidden Woods and Bergenworth area. The cavern is also filled with tombstones. My initial thought when I first played the game was that the tombstones were from the graveyard above and they had collapsed down into it when they had dug the passageway up to the clinic. With 7 or 8 playthroughs worth of hindsight, though, I think it's a lot more likely that the cavern we're looking at here is actually part of the labyrinth that we know as the Chalice Dungeons. I'll go into depth on the labyrinth in another video, but for now I just want to say that I am reasonably convinced that the labyrinth is located, at least in part, directly underneath Forbidden Woods and Bergenworth. The labyrinth is filled with tombs and gravestones, and if you look at the description of the Hintertomb Chalice, it's also in the name, obviously, the entire Hintertomb area is just one gigantic graveyard that's still to this day being expanded by the Watchers. Now, this cavern is clearly not connected physically to the rest of the labyrinth because we can't access anywhere else from it, but the labyrinth is very, very old, and it's entirely possible that there's been some kind of cave-in that's sealed off this area. We also find what looks like a combination of cold blood flowers and tomb mold. If this is tomb mold, that does suggest that this is part of the labyrinth, as that's where tomb mold grows. And in a very interesting little detail that I have no idea if it was intentional or not, but one of the things that you need to use the East Chalice, which the choir are in possession of, is fully matured tomb mold. So perhaps they're using this place to harvest tomb mold to help them access the East dungeons. The obvious problem with that, though, is that if we go down there, we don't find any actual collectible tomb mold. So that's probably just bollocks. We also find these extremely annoying parasite maggot worm things. These appear to be extremely significant, although I don't exactly know how or why. The official guide calls these parasitic leeches, and they're found only here, obviously, the Chalice Dungeons, Canehurst, and the Nightmare of Mensis. If you ever fought the headless version of the bloodletting beast, you'll also know that when you get it down to, I think, half health, a huge version of this creature will burst out of the stump where its head was attached and function basically as a new head. And the other thing about that particular bloodletting beast is that all signs point to it actually being Lawrence. So these leeches are clearly significant, I just don't know in what way yet. But that's another video, so I'll call it here. It's already half an hour. I thought it would be 10 minutes long. I was thinking, oh, the last video was half an hour long. I should pick something simple without any Lovecraft quotations. I'll do Iosefka's Clinic. It's already recorded, and now it's even longer. So, see you next time. I'll probably do The Hunter's Dream, and it will be 8 hours long.